What I'm going to do is pretty much anything you do with a cichlid tank, with these guys, the Lake Malawi cichlids, anything that you do with them is going to get destroyed within a couple of weeks for sure, maybe even a couple days. So I've got a lot of big guys in here. What I'm trying to do is to sort of grade the rock, the sand or whatever, the gravel, into the center of the tank, and I'm just pushing it back and kind of making a ridge, trying to keep it out of the corners. These guys poop like no tomorrow. Not lying at all, but anyways, I've basically been out in the driveway pressure washing. What do we call this rock, Ryan? Do you remember what this is called? Can you get down on that there? You on that shot?
Yeah.
Remember what this is called, where it's from?
Africans.
No, it's not African. Right here in North America. Remember the Holy Rock?
Yeah.
Remember how we bought it in Chicago? Where'd that guy get it from? It's down south in Texas. So it's Texas Holy Rock.
And they live in it.
Yeah, well, they like to have all sorts of ins and outs. So when I set the rocks up here, I try to balance it so I don't ever run the risk of breaking the tank. But anyways, I've got all my big rocks here. This is the biggest one. Ryan, you probably don't remember what I had to do to this one, but I ended up cutting it in half because it had a big bottom piece on it. So got a big hole there for somebody small to hide. So it's gonna go in the center of the tank. You getting it there?
Yeah.
Cool, because I'm gonna do a little cavern over here. Kind of like what popular video game, Ryan?
Minecraft.
Yeah, it's for real though. Alright, it's time for things to get real over here in the Lake Malawi African cichlid tank. Put some over here too. Oh, it's a mad dash. It's a mad dash. Just power washed all the rocks yesterday. Gave the aquarium a 15-gallon water change. And we move over to this side of the room. We have all of our electric blue Acara fry that are growing up bigger and bigger every day. There are 13 of them there. And there is the Proud Papa. And over here. One of his female mates passed away earlier this week, so sad times. However, I think a new queen has been picked. She's hiding out down there in the foliage. These guys right now are going to get some dried shrimp. Kind of reminds me of like a beef bouillon cube, but anyways, just crush it up here. See, they're already, some of them are pretty dialed in on when dinner occurs. I always kind of wonder what the difference is between the fish that go up top to eat and the fish that stay on the bottom to wait for everything to float down. So this is my other 75-gallon aquarium right here. Hello, Piper. You can sit and watch the fish with me. It's a very moving moment here. Yesterday, my fish were acting really lethargic. They were hiding out in the grass. They were hiding out in the plants down here below. And so I went to check the thermometer, and I was reading about 70 degrees, and my heater inside there was cranked all the way up to 80, and the aquarium itself wasn't hot at all. So I wound up going to the pet store and buying a new here, which has now gotten it up pretty well. But these are really gross. These are like bloodworm. These are called bloodworms, and basically they're just a big ball of frozen protein that I'm going to throw in the tank over here. And these guys love bloodworms. It's going to take a few minutes, but they're going to make their way over here. Both of them will. Oh, come on, you know you want to. There's another little guy that's a little loach fish that hangs out in the rock down here. He's been known to grab these too, but uh-oh. Oh, scared him. You gotta be perfectly still. She's going in. It's group effort. Looks like the boy fish is trying to get more of it. Nope. Piper, shut up. She's protecting us from fellow dog walkers and bikers and families with their children. These guys are so cool. I love how colorful they are. They're pretty easy to take care of too, not gonna lie. I mean, I had that one that passed away, but she'd produced a lot of fry in the last couple months, so I would imagine these guys will be making some fry here before too much longer. That's why I'm feeding them high protein, and I've turned the temperature up in the tank up to about 80. We're at about 78 degrees right now, so I'd say in another day or two, when the tank gets up to temperature speed, I'd say they'll probably make some fry. Hello, you lucky people. This is Mr. Walsh talking to you on April 19th, 2020. This is the first video I've made since finding out that we will not be returning to school here in April or May. So the 2019-2020 school year is going out like this. We still have a lot of things to talk about in 7th grade social studies, obviously. I've been cranking out some Civil War videos that you guys are going to be watching. I would much rather be in front of the classroom right now and teaching this and going to work every day. It would be really nice to do that. But I'm also looking forward to the opportunity to have a new challenge. One of the reasons that I was really excited to take on the 7th grade teaching position at the Monticello Middle School a few years back was the opportunity to teach the Civil War. Studying the Civil War was a big part of my undergrad experience, as was, anytime you take American history in high school and middle school, it's always going to be a very, well-documented event. There are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books out there about the Civil War, personalities, Abraham Lincoln, the politics, local histories, battles, small skirmishes. The source of study for the Civil War is pretty inexhaustible. When you take a look at all these books. So yeah, it sucks that we won't be going back to school this year, but you guys are lucky because you guys aren't seniors. You guys, it's definitely the oddest thing I've lived through, I think. The oddest thing I've seen in my lifetime. I think it's the oddest thing a lot of people have seen. When you look back at like the history of the country, there's never been anything like what's taking place right now with the quarantine. The issue of states' rights and federal rights are apparent once again, talking about how governors and all these people are reacting to what's happening. I don't really think anybody has a clear prediction or a clear view of how we're going to get out of where we're at right now. Medical science will provide the majority of those answers and those facts. Right now, you're you're kind of in that point where people have been pent up for 5 weeks now in a lot of places, and I think people are wanting to step outside and do more. I mean, we saw that with the opening of the beaches in Florida yesterday and all these people. I went out for a really long bike ride this afternoon, and of course there were lots and lots of people, but you were still able to keep your distance away from people, away from, it's kind of annoying though when people stand in the middle of the bike path and carry on conversations with somebody like they haven't seen each other, so they're catching up, which is totally cool. I understand wanting to have that, but don't park yourself right in front of the path, because then I'll have to ride around you and all that. So why do I call the American Civil War, why do I call Unit 6 the American Iliad? I'm not the first person to kind of refer back to the American Civil War as being like this Greek myth, like Homer wrote about with the Trojans and the Greeks, and the 10-year war, and then the return of Ulysses on the way back, the Odyssey that follows. It kind of just comes down to the fact that the United States becomes what the United States comes into being following the Civil War. So as I was talking about, there's a lot of really cool information out there on the Civil War. There are tons of books. A lot of these books can be found fairly cheaply at used bookstores. The last 50, 60 years, since basically post-World War II, there's been an amazing amount of scholarship that's taken place concerning the Civil War. The thing you have to remember about the Civil War, though, is that people were writing about it even while and very shortly after it took place. One of those really cool primary sources is, well, I don't know if they're primary. Yeah, they're primary sources. It's a collection of the official records of the various Confederate and Union armies. These are transcripts written from various commanders and various political leaders to their people. This was a huge set. There were hundreds of these volumes that were going to be produced in 10, 15, 20, 30 years after the war. In fact, they're still publishing these by the 1890s, the official records of the war. Some of them are really good. Some of them are obviously inspired a little bit more by politics, but the one that I'm kind of really into right now is this one on the Atlanta campaign. There in 1864 with Sherman's army and its capture of basically the largest city in the South outside of Richmond. There's some other really cool books about the Civil War that I'll be referring to. This is called What They Fought For. It's by the very well-respected Civil War historian named James McPherson. He followed up this book, What They Fought For, with a larger book called For Cause and Comrades. And both of these were a really essential part of my undergraduate reading, and I've gone back to them, even 20 years later. When it comes to teaching you people. So these are pretty readable. Both of these are paperbacks. One of them comes in at about 150 pages, and this one, it's a little bit of a higher reading level, but, this thing here comes in at, just under 70 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. Last year I had the opportunity to go to Shiloh, and there in the gift store I bought a book about a Confederate by the name of Patrick Clybourn. He was an Irish immigrant to Arkansas. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he ran for political office. He was a fairly successful local man around his town, but when the Civil War happens, he joins the militia, he joins the units of his home state, and Patrick Clybourn's, the other side of the hill. So reading his biography was pretty cool. This was written by a guy named Craig Simmons, and it was published by the University of Kansas. I always find it's good when you're reading history, particularly about the Civil War, to focus on books that are coming out of colleges, that are coming out of universities. Some of those, might not be as accessible to us or to your interests, but you're always going to have pretty factual stuff. There's sort of the standard American history of the war. There's this book, there's a series of books written by Bruce Catton. This is the American Heritage version of the American Civil War. There's all sorts of great pictures and maps and really cool kind of bird's eye views of the battle. This was published back in the 60s and 70s, and it's been reprinted many, many times. And that's going to form actually the basis for Ken Burns' Civil War, that documentary series that's about 30 years old, but it's still very watchable. Unfortunately, I was looking on Netflix the other day and they've taken it off of rotation, but you still might be able to pick that up. It's a highly watchable very emotionally evocative documentary. Everything that you see in modern documentaries, that have been made like in the last 20 or 30 years, everything that you've seen in modern documentaries was influenced by Ken Burns. And Ken Burns had a huge influence on me, and I'm going to be using some clips from that for educational purposes. There's a few other Civil War books out there that are very readable. I know these books all seem to kind of be big because the Civil War is this huge historical event. There's all kinds of stuff happening everywhere across the United States when the war between the states is being fought. But this is a series by Shelby Foote. It's a trilogy, 1, 2, 3, and it's basically written, I wouldn't say from a complete Southern perspective, but there's a lot of criticism that professional historians will have. In fact, Shelby Foote's not a historian. He's a novelist. He was a fiction writer, had a very colorful life. He passed away a few years ago, but he played a pretty big role and grew into sort of a national celebrity on Ken Burns' The Civil War. And he's kind of this, Mississippi Southern accent and talks like a, kind of our stereotypical Southern gentleman. But it's a very readable study of the war as well, and it's heavily researched. The biggest criticism, besides having a little bit of a Southern bias in it, is that Shelby Foote doesn't use footnotes. And footnotes in history, that's where we get the information from and where it's cited and what books and sources we used. When you don't use footnotes in your history, it's kind of hard to take it as seriously as you would somebody like McPherson or Simmons or more of your modern academic writers. But let's get into something really quickly here on the notes on kind of what I want to talk about in the whole story. The first video that you're going to see, I'm going to be rehashing a lot of the themes that we talked about that you've done last week in your books, the textbook work there. I had to give myself a little bit of a break to get caught up on the videos there. And what you're going to see, what I find to be, come on now, one of the most fascinating documents that I find in American history and the Civil War by far. This is a collection of portraits, 6 of the surviving soldiers of the American Revolution. And so right there in the front, this is Lemuel Cook, aged 105, one of the survivors of the Revolution. These guys were all going to be teenagers during the American Revolution, but this was actually collected. It says the last men of the American Revolution. These guys are all still alive in 1864. So you've got Samuel Downing there, age 102, Adam Link, age 102, Daniel Waldo, age 102, William Hutchins, age 100, and then down here, Alexander Milliner, who looks really good there at age 100. I mean, you think about all the events that these gentlemen experienced in their lifetimes and how they've, grew up. They were born probably as subjects of the crown, subjects of King George, and then to live through, not only the American Revolution, but westward expansion, the War of 1812, the rise of Jacksonian democracy, and this idea of westward expansion. Who knows if these guys kept up on current events, but they had to be aware of the times in which they were living. Not to get too far down the rabbit hole, but this is a family picture from my mom's side. This is the Carlin family, and the old man seated in the chair here, this is Dan Carlin. This guy brought the family name over from Ireland. He was born in the Emerald Island and immigrated to the United States in the 1850s, as a lot of ancestors did on both sides of my family. Daniel Carlin served in what was called the 107th Illinois, and it's a fairly documented regiment. The history of the regiment takes place primarily in Tennessee. They moved into Georgia, and then they wound up taking the fight all the way to North Carolina by the end of the war. But Dan Carlin, and he is my great-great-grandfather. So kind of a fascinating story there. One of his boys that's seated there, I'm not too sure which one, but one of his sons is a guy by the name of John Carlin. And John Carlin went to World War I. John Carlin served there 1917, 1918. He went to France. Some of the research that I've done on BMET during World War I falls back onto the Civil War. I mean, the men that were in their teens and their 20s in the 1860s, these guys are going to be old men when the First World War is being fought, and a lot of their sons and a lot of their grandsons are going to be in uniform. Now, I say all that to say this. John Carlin was an old man when I was a very, very young child, younger than my own children, there in Bement, Illinois. And I remember seeing John out in his yard gardening and doing all sorts of work. And he probably would have been around the age of, he would have been in his definitely by his probably late 80s, early 90s, back in the 1980s. So one of the ways I like us to consider thinking about the Civil War is this stuff didn't happen that long ago. There were people that your parents would have seen, the really elderly people who would have been, kids and teenagers there in the early part of the 20th century. They would have lived with Civil War veterans. So it happens within about 3 lifetimes of us when we talk about the Civil War. That wasn't a long time ago. 150, 160 years ago in terms of generations and chronology. We're still feeling the effects of the Civil War, and there's a lot of things that the Civil War always will go back to. It's that American Iliad where everything always returns to the Civil War. It always returns to those issues of states' rights. It always returns to the issue of authority and what do we want from our federal government, but also to the idea of what we are as a country. I'm not the first person to say this. I'm simply repeating. In fact, I'm going to be repeating a lot of what's already been written, a lot of what's already been said about the Civil War. Nothing that I really have to say about the Civil War is terribly original. There's a quote about the Civil War where it says, before the war we were people from Alabama, we were people from Illinois, we were New Yorkers, we were people from New Hampshire. After the war, everybody tends to consider themselves to be Americans. And the Civil War, there's so many changes that happen within those 4 or 5 years of the conflict. The effects, it takes a very long time. I would say people are still trying to figure out how the Civil War changed us as a country. Many of the things that the Civil War set out to stop continued by other means. We're going to get to, by the end of our time together in May, we're going to get to the Reconstruction Era, which is the Reconstruction of the South. I mean, we all know how this story ends. But the promises of Reconstruction and the promises of emancipation and the abolition of slavery, those promises really aren't going to be completely realized. Arguably, they're still being fought for today, but you're going to see a continuation of that stuff when we talk about this. When you guys talk about the civil rights movement in 8th grade. So, the Civil War, the Confederates. I would argue the Confederacy loses the political battle. They lose the military battle, but they're going to still be able to maintain this racial hierarchy that exists in the United States. So basically, this week in a nutshell, you guys are going to have to watch on Monday or Tuesday the first video where I sort of rehash the beginnings of the Civil War, going all the way back to James Buchanan's presidency and Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln having their debates in Illinois. The second video is going to deal with basically 1861, the Battle of Bull Run, some of the early actions that take place. And then my goal is to have the third video that you'll watch basically for like Thursday and Friday. That third video is going to cover the battle that takes place in Tennessee, the Battle of Shiloh. So it's sort of ambitious, but I think we can get there. As far as writing assignments are concerned, I'll be posting those on Google Classroom, some questions that you'll have. I'm going to try to utilize some of the work I've already done for the Civil War in years past. I'm going to make some of that available to you guys that are going to be online, that are going to be doing the work from Google Classroom. But then I also want to be able to include people that don't have access and are going to be getting the work from, you know, the document that gets sent out there for all the 7th grade teachers in the middle school. So all that being said, keep emailing me questions. I'm always able to field those. I get back to you in about 24 hours on that. I try to anyways. Keep turning stuff in, marking it complete there in Teacher Ease. You people, some of you guys are still turning stuff in from a couple weeks ago. That's fine. I appreciate it. Let's keep it flowing. Other than that, stay tuned and keep on keeping on.